Good afternoon again. We're ready for positions, so please take your positions. If I may, let me just say a word. I've been asked by about a dozen people about Edward Seckler, who, of course, was very instrumental to the ideas that we've been discussing to the school. Edward just turned 90 at the end of September. He's in Vienna, as he usually is at this time of year. He tried hard to kind of make it here. He wanted to make it here. It's a little bit hard for him. He'll be back in the spring, and the school will host some little kind of celebration of his 90th birthday. But he's certainly here in spirit. I think my role is just to introduce Professor Hashim Sarkis, the Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism in Muslim Societies, and also Director of the Aga Khan Program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Another long-standing member of our faculty, someone very committed to the field of urban design and urbanism. And please welcome him. He will introduce his panel.
Good afternoon. Sanford Quinter was initially supposed to moderate this panel, and I was to give a position. Unfortunately, Sanford could not make it, so Alex asked me if I could do both. And here I am going to be giving my position, but also moderating other people's position to my advantage, of course. My intention this afternoon is simply to allow for these different positions to be put on the same table in order to heighten their differences and also heighten their originality. And without much ado, I just want to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order, asking each one to come up, stick to more or less the time, stick to the time, and then we will open up the panel for discussion. The order will be Professor Pierre Bélanger from the GSD, Professor Anita Berisbeta, Andres Douani, Hashim Sarkis, Michael Sorkin, Georgine Theodore, and José Luis Vallejo. Pierre.
Thank you, Hashim. And thanks for being here. Doug, if we could get the lights and the first slide, please. I'll be presenting both a position as well as the project of landscape infrastructure towards understanding urbanism as it moves beyond engineering. I'm going to present this position with in the foreground of research work as well as project work in the past years. The inertia of urban planning and overexertion of civil engineering at the close of the 20th century is putting into question the capacities of single disciplines to address complex challenges. Precipitated by the transition from industrialization to urbanization worldwide, three cumulative shifts are triggering change in patterns of urban development. One, the rise of ecological concerns, the crisis of public works planning in the 1980s, the erosion of post-war engineered structures in the 1990s onwards. The timeline of failures, the timeline of breakdowns, the timeline of disasters, failures, and breakdowns in the past 3 decades has been skyrocketing, ranging from sudden power outages in the Northeast, rolling blackouts in the Southwest, to bridge collapses in Minnesota and Montreal, to the oil spills and hurricanes and levee breaks on the Gulf Coast. These events are exacerbated by the spread of standard end-of-pipe engineering, Euclidean land use zoning, and uncoordinated reactionary planning. The vertical and inflexible industrial structure of cities today largely explains the unchecked dependence on centralized systems of water abstraction, waste landfilling, oil import, food processing, soil depletion, and uniform transportation. This is a phenomenon that was aptly captured by John Kenneth Galbraith one of the preeminent economists of the 20th century, who said in 1967 that in the last century, capital and power became more important than land. Signaling a critical tipping point, the re-examination of historical practices reveals that the landscape of biological processes and natural resources integral to the larger regional systems cannot and should not be segregated from the discourse or the design of urban infrastructure. This inseparability expresses an urgent need for the decoupling of current models of city governance and for the distribution of spatial patterns that combine new demands with existing conditions. With the rise of individual purchasing power during the proto-urbanization of North America in the past century, really since the 1920s, and its demand for mass housing, for mass mobility, and mass communications, the challenge of emissions and effluence over the past century, the sprawl of urban populations, and the general oversupply of credit at the dawn of the 21st century presents overwhelming evidence, and the situation is urgent. In order to initiate a more ecologically responsive, socially expedient, culturally relevant, and fiscally effective reorganization of urban lands, one of the central questions that I've been asking myself is, how can we rebundle and redesign essential urban services ranging from water resources and waste cycling, energy generation and food cultivation, mass mobility and network communications as living landscapes that span the divide between ecology and economy facing contemporary cities? One could also ask, is the estimated $5.5 trillion project of urban renewal and the defense of the more than 3 billion people around the world living in coastal zones such an opportunity? Emerging from these ecological imperatives and economic exigencies, the project of landscape infrastructure proposes an expanded operating system for contemporary cities where the full complexity of biodynamic processes and resources are visualized and deployed across the full footprint of urbanism and the life cycles of infrastructure. As a departure from conventional bureaucratic and centralized forms of civic administration, this contemporary formulation foreshadows a more flexible, cooperative, and process-driven agency for the design disciplines as an alliance with a commitment to the metrics of design, research, and implementation. From this position, design strategies can be launched between two extremes: short, intermediate interventions that are graduated and sequenced over long periods of time with large, durable geopolitical and ecological effects. Design, including the research that precedes it, becomes telescopic, capable of integrating multiple scales of intervention at once. Invoking the unfinished project of landscape as a geobotanical and as a geospatial discipline with the softer, more fluid field of ecological systems pioneered by Odom, the double entendre of the landscape infrastructure project maintains an operative, polyfunctional objective dedicated to urban renewal and operational dualization. Sponsoring transboundary crossover, this nascent field implies, or this nascent project implies, a dual identity for single-use infrastructure along corridors of movement, where synthesis of ecology preconditions the detail of implementation. Where long-term resource management is as important as the short-term mobilization of capital, where the Commonwealth of Public Systems presides over the uncoordinated guise of self-interests, requiring the sustained engagement of public and private motives. Transcending jurisdictional boundaries, the integrative and horizontal enterprise of the landscape infrastructure project enlists geographic zoning, boundary realignments, strategic design, subsurface programming, sectional thickening, and ecological engineering as some of the most influential mechanisms in the structural transformation of urban regions to effect change on the large-scale logistical aspects of urbanization. Staging uncertainty and harnessing contingency become the new urban imperatives through the design of robust and flexible edges, margins, and peripheries. In the most extreme of circumstances, landscape demonstrates its suppleness as le plan libre par excellence. In spite of our urban adolescence, the Athenian oath that has been restraining urban designers from going beyond the city into landscape territories for the past 2,000 years can finally loosen its grip and make way for new instruments and new methods for intervening at geospatial scales. The linear, fixed, and closed mechanisms of the industrial economy are quickly fading away in the background of a more flexible, circular, and network system of urban economies. Releasing the pristine ideals of the city for the sake of security, permanence, or density opens a horizon on new social equities as well as new regional synergies beyond that of a few exceptional precedents. In the wake of the over-planning and over-engineering in the past century, it's clear that the strategic engagement of the landscape of living systems as urban infrastructure is already moving ahead by governments worldwide, engineering consultancies, and adopted by professional design offices, as well as academic researchers. Either in slums, suburbs, or skyscrapers, paradigms are changing. Dispersal is subbing in for density, pace instead of space, sequence over speed, design instead of technology, concurrency over control, culture instead of growth. In short, ecology is urbanism's best insurance policy. For if we don't pay attention to the effects of global change and engage regions as urban constructed ecologies, it is not we who will design the future flows of urbanization, but rather they will be designing us. Thank you.
Can I have my first slide? Okay. I begin my presentation with images of two objects that were presented at world fairs at the end of the 19th century. The top image is the management plan for Biltmore Forest by Gifford Pinchot, published in his brochure titled Biltmore Forest, an account of its treatment and the result of the first year's work, which he and Olmsted had been working on in Asheville, North Carolina for the estate of George Washington Vanderbilt. The 100,000-acre forest was the first of its kind built in the United States, following the principles of scientific forest management. 3,000 copies were printed and distributed at the Chicago's World's Fair in 1893. At the bottom is an image of the 1-ton plaster model of Metropolitan Boston, featuring the Metropolitan Park system designed by Charles Eliot and Sylvester Baxter in 1893. The model was made for the Paris Exposition of 1900 and was also exhibited later on in the Buffalo, St. Louis, and Portland, Oregon international fairs. Both projects were presented as technological inventions, innovative advances that would lead the way to a better future. More importantly for us here, they were a response to economic, environmental, and urban conditions that are almost identical to the ones we face today. Laissez-faire capitalism, broadly institutionalized since colonial times, rapid urbanization, and accelerated population growth had provoked an environmental crisis just like the one we talk about now. The population of the United States more than tripled during the second half of the 19th century, with the largest amounts of people living in cities. New York's population increased more than sixfold, while Boston's population quadrupled. As it is today, the exhaustion of natural resources was widely discussed too. The prediction was that coal, American oil, and forests would soon be depleted. Americans feared an increase in the price of energy from high-cost mining and timber and dependence on imports from abroad. In terms of global trade, the United States was rising not only in its production, but also its consumption of energy. It was the leading producer of coal by 1905, with an output of more than 50% that of England, the second producer worldwide. These conditions were vividly portrayed in the 10th Census of the United States, published in 1880, the first census that was undertaken in this country to, in addition of accounting for the population, to account for all natural resources. And Charles Sargent, the director of the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, was charged with the task of counting all the trees in the American territory, including the loss of forest density, which you see here. The lighter green color is less than, it increases from the lighter to the darkest, and it's interesting the relationship to the to urban areas. So he's here mapping loss of forest, and he is here mapping consumption of energy, among other things. Indeed, the conditions on the ground of the future Biltmore Forest exemplified the conditions of much of the American territory. Unsustainable agricultural practice in place since colonization had depleted the topsoil, creating extensive erosion and a territory unable to sustain any kind of living system, and also incapable of sustaining urbanized areas. This is an early image of the high-yield forest, probably around the second decade of the 20th century. And these are the existing conditions today. And here you see the, excuse me, let's see. Where's the button? All right, you'll see the shape of the river on both as a way to guide your, let's see, here's the river, and this is all the Biltmore Forest today with the city around it. Okay, and here is the 1893 plan for the Metropolitan Park System for Boston, describing the city as a territory that lay between a ring of hills to the west and the sea to the east. The criteria Eliot produced for choosing the system of open spaces was first, protect the three rivers that drain the Boston Basin, the Mystic, the Charles, and the Neponset rivers, which are the main drainage ways, and the reason was for flood control. Second, protect the seashore, and the reason was flood control and public accessibility. Third, protect the tops of the drumlins for reasons of public accessibility and protection of viewsheds. Fourth, provide an even distribution of large reserves in a ring-like shape within 10 miles of the center. These would act as the anchors that would guide the expansion of the city. Fifth, and contrasting in scale, were a constellation of small municipal playgrounds and parks, and later on were added parkways, boulevards for connectivity, forming the last layer of a complex system of, to use a word from current design vocabulary, extraordinary performativity, in which landscape, from a regional to a neighborhood scale, served as a structuring element for future urban expansion. And here you see an infrared image of how the city has grown around the Metropolitan Park System. It is clear to me that Eliot, Pinchot, Olmsted, etc. were inventing solutions to problems that were fundamentally urban. And those problems gave the impetus for the invention of new forms of urbanization. In addition to the actual infrastructural frameworks that we can see today, they also left us new methodologies of design, demonstrated the uses of new technologies, invented new forms of representation, mainly the overlay method we use to this day, new forms of public engagement. In other words, they gave us new standards of practice. Given the parallels between then and now, what positions what might one formulate that can learn from the earlier ones? And I can list at least 4 of them. One of them is to engage an amplified context, delivered by global-scale economic processes. Obviously, Pierre just expanded beautifully on that. Cities are as epiphenomena of larger economic and social processes. Urban design has to engage systems no matter how remote they appear, however affect the performance, the growth, and development of the city. The second is to adopt new technologies that will advance design methodologies and expand the tools and the conceptual boundaries of the discipline. What would be the components of that network today? If Elliott's urban network was made of flood control, public spaces, viewsheds, and recreation, what would be priorities now? The network today would certainly be comprised of energy, agriculture, water, and many other complex metropolitan phenomena, such as migration, informal economies, or the loss of genetic biodiversity. Engage a legislative process to more effectively address issues of urbanization, and these may include inventing new categories of public space that more precisely deal with problems of health, nutrition, new forms of agriculture, inactivity, excess heat, comfort, and so forth. And finally, reorganize and recalibrate systems as a way to redefine priorities. This will inevitably lead to the invention of new forms of urbanism that give tangible form to new and better futures. Thank you.
Does it work this way as well? Does it work this way? Yesterday, Marion Weiss made a beautiful hand gesture, and it was hidden by the nameplate. I think it's a horrible idea to actually speak behind things, because you need to be able to express yourself fully. So that's why I'm standing here rather awkwardly. I need actually to explain that I've actually been thinking about this for a long time, and I thought the subject was actually going to be CERT and the 50 years of the GSD's urban design program. And so inevitably, I'm going to speak about this. And I want to thank Alex and Gerald for providing us with a very organized conference. You know, there was the recent history, the present, and then today, the future. And I'm going to respond and make some very, I think, elemental positions relative to each of them. In terms of CERT, CERT has been alluded to very often, but very little analyzed. Perhaps it's because Eric Mumford's book did so, perhaps because so much is known about CERT, but there's something strangely inaccessible about him in the presentation. And so I wish to engage him in the kind of way that new urbanists do, which is we ruthlessly criticize. We were born of critique, and we really criticize, not in the academic way, we're actually critical. First thing that comes up with CERT is that it was actually an almost complete failure in terms of urbanism. He built absolutely nothing. None of his urban plans were built. Now, several buildings were built, and they're very good indeed for their period. 4 buildings in Boston, large ones, a little house, a museum in France, 2 apartment buildings in Barcelona, finito. That's what he did. Okay, we need to assess him as one of the most successful architects of his decade or his period, and actually one of the most dismal failures in terms of urbanism. And this was a period in which new towns were being built everywhere, not just Ciudad Guyana, but 30 new towns in Britain, God knows how many in France, Belgium, Scandinavia, Sweden, 3 or 4 in the United States. It was the great period of new towns, and this man, who actually is your leader, built none. There was something terribly flawed about him, and it was what the French so elegantly state as a déformation professionnelle. He was deformed. Now, when you're deformed, you don't take on those genetics and carry them for 50 years. And I'd like to propose that his failures were the following. And I'm not going to psychologically analyze what happened to that generation that, in fact, was bypassed by the grandees of SIAM and outperformed by the skip generation of Team 10. Something happened to those guys that made them weird. But I'm not going to analyze that. What I am going to say is that there were 2 things that I think were signal failures. Every one of his successful buildings were done for institutions. They were done for authorities. They were done for campuses. They were done for building committees. They were done, I'm not going to say dictators, but because in fact he even failed with the dictators. He could only work with authorities. And that brings up something that I think has always been absent with the GSD at Harvard, which is what I call subsidiarity, which is how do you manage others over time to get things done? And it's a word that can be looked up. It says, which is the appropriate group at the appropriate time that can make a competent decision? And he never thought about that. And I think that that remains a flaw in the GSD and the GSD teaching. Once you do the beautiful design and the beautiful presentation, how is it that you implement? And there are methodologies, and many other people did implement, CERT did not. The second thing, which is a flaw, is an almost complete absence of empirical input. And this comes through in Eric Mumford's book, which is, after you have read the SIAM, what is it called, the SIAM Theory and Urbanism, the SIAM Discourse on Urbanism, which when it came out, I read it that summer, I was riveted, underline, 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 incredibly excited. I even wrote a book report on it, which I don't normally do. And I sent it to the board of the CNU, and I said, look at this. It was one of the most exciting books I ever read. So when the second one came out, I said, oh, good. Second, I couldn't stay awake. The whole book was cyclical, boring. There were no characters. There were no personalities. There was just a restatement, ever more poignant restatement of questions. How do we really approach this? It was plainer as Hamlet. Nothing but question, question, question. And yet, outside the door in Boston, everything he asked was present. Between Boston, the downtown, between Cambridge, between the Harvard campus, there isn't a single thing that he asked about that was not present, except what was outside the discourse was empirical observation. And what I saw presented every single time today were allusions to perfectly successful urbanisms, these aerial photographs that you saw, perfectly good, and somehow without any discussion, they were not to be looked upon as sources or as settings. So among the genetics that you inherited was the questioning, the ever-questioning. We only question, we don't provide answers, and of course the implications, there are many answers. The ultimate manifestation of this was a horrifying essay by Michael Hayes, who goes on for 8 pages and ends, in the end, he says, therefore let us hesitate. Okay, that's a real problem with students, and some people from the 60s said, that's the problem. You know, we really have to have a belief system. Now I bring up the present. An extraordinary thing has happened here at Harvard in the last year, which is the advent of ecological urbanism. Now that is a huge thing that has happened, not only because in fact it is the first program in the Ivy League that is actually engaging ecology. Because it is the Ivy League, it's the only program that's actually going to engage designers in ecology. It's going to be the first time that this wonderful and important stuff is going to be properly presented physically, and not by bureaucrats or hairy people or left-wingers, but by real designers, which actually Harvard can actually do. It's an extraordinary advent. It is not being received properly as the revolution that it is. Everyone says, yes, it's just ecology. No, for Harvard, it's revolutionary. And the reason it's revolutionary is that it's the first time that somebody has planted a stake. Everybody's sitting around here in a little cafe, wearing little berets, writing little tracts about how the revolution is to happen. And finally, the guys come in with the mud and the boots and plant a flag and say, this is what we're doing. And it's very simple to explain, and we're going to do it, and we're going to do it fast because it's important. You know, that is a completely new position for Harvard. And it's extraordinary. It couldn't be more salutary that you do it. It is the pivotal position. And let me tell you, when you look at the chronological outline out there, you've tried everything. Everything's been tried. Except an explicit, a positivistic belief system. And look that up, what positivism means, because that's what you're getting for the first time. Now, what happens in the future? We saw what happened this morning. One of the things that's extraordinary about we, the new urbanists, is that we became progressively more certain as we became progressively more successful. And by the way, the genetic material that we generated has been absorbed by the ITE, the ULI, the APA, et cetera. You know, we have the virus theory in the absence of your, or may I say, in the presence of your critique, which you actually believed, you left the field clear. You really did think that all we did was picket fences for white people in the South. Now, that's a wonderful position, you know, from which to attack us, but you don't believe your own polemic, and so you left the field clear. Now, what's happened is that everything broke in 2007. The century ended. It didn't end in 2000. It ended in 2007, 2008. And everything that broke landed on our way, our side. There are three major things. Of course, peak oil. That has everything to do with what the new urbanists do. Number two, the metric ended up being carbon. Carbon of all things, not acid rain, carbon. What does carbon have to do? Of course, green buildings, but everything else is walking, walking, walking. Okay, walking in transit. Completely landed in our lap. And the third thing that landed was what kept suburbia, in fact, normative as suburban typologies were the securitizing of real estate that actually prevented the new urbanists from fully penetrating because the typologies that we needed were exceptional and they could not be bundled in groups of 200 or 300 so Prudential could actually mince them up and resell them. They were not normative. That broke apart completely. The normative broke apart. And so everything landed on our side. What have we done to deal with this? You know, what is our critique? What's the present? There are several things. It's taken about 2 or 3 years to actually see what was and see what is to be. Now, what set me off in this particular thing is that one of the statements that everybody agreed on, and rather enthusiastically yesterday, was when someone in the audience said, oh, by the way, we don't know what the future is. I'm going to finish. We don't know what the future is. We don't know what the future is. We can't even tell 25 years ahead, and everybody agreed so anxiously, yeah, we don't know. That's the one thing we don't know is what the future is. Well, you know what? If you don't know what the future is, you can't be an urbanist, because it's all about the future. If you can't think 25 years out, then don't even try it. You have to make that proposition. And it is possible to tell what is 25 years out. Perhaps not 50 and 100, but certainly 25. I'm going to tell you what is perfectly evident, and none of it was mentioned today. Somebody actually mentioned class, gender, and race, believe it or not, in this late date. And they didn't mention age. And it's all about age. Okay? It's a hugely aging population, and it determines everything, and the American landscape does not provide for them. They literally, 80% of the American landscape cannot tolerate an aging population. Because they can't drive when you're old, you actually starve. What are we going to do about that? Okay? Unless, of course, the boomers and the Ys and the tweeners are going to just become chauffeurs, which is a horrible fate, might yet happen. Something needs to be done about retrofitting the nation for the aging population, which brings up the second thing. About 80% of America is suburban sprawl. It all needs to be retrofitted. It's first-generation work, and any student that graduates needs to march through the 18 suburban typologies and know how to retrofit them into something that actually is fitting for the 20th century, and that's called grayfield work. Not just brownfields, mentioned a million times, but gray fields. How do we get that stuff that's embedded in parking and retrofit it? It's first generation, and it's absolutely necessary. Most of the people who are studying here, that's what they're going to do in their professional lives. And it can actually be addressed, and it's profoundly satisfying to do it. By the way, there's also called red fields, which are the bankruptcies, you know, just in case. And there are a lot of them, and we haven't yet figured out how to deal with them. The third thing that's going to happen in the 21st century is that these three crises that went through have permanently impoverished us. It's not temporary, it's a permanent impoverishment. Okay? It ain't coming back the old way, not even close. We've been shoveling the money out to the oil-producing countries. The wealth of America, 300 years of accumulated wealth has gone over, and we don't have it anymore. And you will see municipal bankruptcies happening. And then we're going to finally realize, probably 2 or 3 years from now, that we're poor. And when we're poor, the models of the last 20 years, which is what we saw here, don't work at all. Everything we saw this morning was highly dependent on money, which no longer exists, at least in these shores. Elsewhere they do. What are we going to do? Now, what did the new urbanists do? Our model was actually the 1920s. For marketing reasons, the highest value per square foot was the 1920s. That's gone too. There are no bankers. You know what our model is now that we're studying? We're studying the 1850s. The 1850s, there wasn't a banking system, and yet we were able to colonize an entire continent, cash on the barrelhead. Okay? Building roads, infrastructure sequentially, one step at a time, etc. It is possible to do that if that model gets brought forward. It's a wonderful model. You begin with one-story inaugural conditions. We can no longer project the final condition. We can no longer project the climax condition. We cannot defy gravity. We have to start from the beginning. And that's a discipline that needs to be brought front and center. Okay? And if you see what's happening with the new urbanism now, you will see, again, first-story buildings ready to become something else. Now, there are a few other things that have to do with politics and so forth, but those essentially are the positions that I think should be at least inscribed into the new GSD, particularly now that the model has been so healthily broken by some true revolutionaries who actually have made finally a proposition that should actually break the thrall of Sert. Thank you.
I'm going to speak from behind the podium, but I will concentrate my expression in my face. So. This position statement titled "The World According to Architecture" comes out of New Geographies, a course and now a lab, which I've been running at the GSD since 2006. I'm very grateful to the students who have participated in the class, particularly to those who took part in the last iteration of it on imagining a city world beyond Cosmopolis last spring, and also to the doctorate students who have launched the journal New Geographies. Their research and insights have helped shape many aspects of this position. The world according to architecture. Why should the global city, or cosmopolis, as it has been called, be considered the ultimate spatial manifestation of globalization? If financial information and demographic flows are challenging national boundaries, why is it that our imagination about space is still bound to the city and city, region, state order as its limit? Could we find an equivalent to the scope of globalization in the space of the world as one spatial entity, as a city world? The scope of the world, which I'm proposing as an alternative to the limited scope of Cosmopolis, predates the advent of globalization. At least since H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, science fiction has imagined the world as one entity, as a city world, whether in Asimov's Trantor or in more popular renditions such as Star Wars, Coruscant, and Death Star. Albeit projected into a distant future or a distant past, like in Star Wars, they speak to a present yearning for a spatial totality at the scale of the world. Discerning this yearning from a totalizing project such as that of empire or colonialism is as necessary as it is difficult. But in the context of imagining the world as one entity, we cannot overlook the artificial boundaries that such political aspirations have cleared. However, it is necessary to distinguish the pursuits of totalities from totalizing projects if we are to persist in developing clearer mappings or representations of the world. Frederick Jameson's use of Kevin Lynch's cognitive mapping comes to mind here as a necessary tool for architects and artists. In architecture, the classicist project, and in related ways that of early modernism, has aspired towards a certain equality or sameness across the world, across national boundaries. This aspiration was driven by more of a temporal understanding of the world than a spatial one. The world it imagined wanted to move together in sync. Not that a spatial conception was lacking, but it was lagging behind. The aspiration for sameness of high modernism emulated and expressed the aspiration for equality among human beings and nations. The criticism of this project are all too familiar, and they have helped us discern the indelible ties between formal and political projects. However, here again, we should not miss out on the outlooks of connectedness and continuity that modern architecture effected across the world. From the 1930s onwards, the qualities of connectedness, continuity, and sameness moved from wish images to become projected outcomes of urban development that needed to be channeled and contained. Jean Gottman's premonition of a megalopolis comes to mind as an example of regional bands of continuous urbanization enabled by increasing forms of communication and transport. Then comes Doxiadis' Ecumenopolis, a city world built along a linear infrastructure grid. Then Yona Friedman, Super Studio, Buckminster Fuller's Geoscope, rendering the finitude and fragility of the world visible to us, and obviously Constant's unitary urbanism, transgressing centrist models of urban growth towards more fluid continuities that heralded what he called the global space of a new Babylon. The recent revival of this cast of renegade characters, however, has primarily focused on their systemic versus imagined approach to urbanism. The rendering of the world as one entity has significantly been overlooked. The global city has somehow eclipsed the city world. The difference between the two models is important to stress, even though the city world should not be seen as the opposite of the global city, or of cosmopolis, or whatever name will be applied to it in the coming years. The city world is the scope, the spatial parameters, the algorithms, land uses, and infrastructures that connect the world and make us actively take part in its description, in its construction, and its perception as a totality. No doubt difficulties abound against thinking the world as one architectural or spatial entity, but these difficulties are slowly, if inadvertently, being overcome. The seeming immodesty of such a proposition should be countered with the scale and scope of risks that contemporary society confronts, be they environmental, nuclear, or epidemic. And therefore, the scope of action these risks generate requires a world-scale response, including coordinating the world's spatial resources and, most importantly, including the world as one entity. Including imagining the world as one entity. I personally am more invested in the latter than the former, as a potent and effective role for architecture. The capacity to understand and map the lived environment beyond the scope of the city, and that corresponds to the new patterns of global mobility and demographic shifts, is now greatly enhanced by new technologies and modes of representation that make us constantly aware of the world as one. The lack of corresponding gubernatorial authority to coordinate shaping the world remains a major impediment to thinking the world. This lack weakens the totalizing dimension of this project, but it also mobilizes architecture to think of ways in which the qualities and the forms that produce their sameness, repetitiveness, connectedness to larger geographic attributes, like the horizon or like transregional phenomena, could mobilize the physical and aesthetic dimensions of form in more effective ways than a very servile association with a political, environmental, ecological project. The emancipatory dimensions of such a scope of imagination and operations predate the global city to as far back as Heraclitus, but they have been unnecessarily bundled up with the larger package of globalization. Social theorists and philosophers like Jean-Luc Nancy, Kostas Axelos, Michel Serres, and even Nelson Goodman have recovered the project of being in the world from the suffocating impositions of globalization. The increasing sameness within cities and between each city and the rest of the world, no doubt, points to the dissolution of place and to the acceleration of development to the point where we can anticipate a world moving in real estate development sync, especially after the last recession and the global risks that it generated. We ought to think again about whether the sameness in the world is a sign of poverty of form or of an untapped richness, a new source of inspiration for architecture. This could point to the fact that we are all worldly, that we work to link the world from wherever we are, to achieve a sense of the totality and to anticipate a city world before and beyond globalization. A world that flows with Heraclitus' river, where identities and places could be constantly constructed and constructed in part by design. But could the world be posited as an architectural question? Increasingly, architects and planners are being compelled to address and transform larger contexts and to give these contexts more legible and expressive form. New problems are being placed in front of us: infrastructure, urban systems, and regional and rural questions. Problems that had been confined to the domains of engineering or ecology are now looking for articulation by design. The need to address what I'm calling geographic aspects of design has also encouraged designers to re-examine their tools and develop means of connecting to their connecting attributes that had been understood to be either separate from each other or external to their disciplines. The importance of such questions as those of sustainability and risk are obviously beginning to put measurable standards in front of us, so that we have to think about the world as a scope of impact and imagination, if not of operation. The role of synthesis that geography had aspired to play between the physical, the economic, and the social is now being increasingly taken on by architecture. Yet engaging the geographic does not only mean a shift in scale. Even at a smaller scale, architects are increasingly investigating forms that reflect the geographic connectedness of architecture by its ability to bridge between the very large and the very small, or to provide forms that embody geographic references. And here, questions of continuous surfaces, megaforms, landforms, geologics are all in front of us as part of this paradigm. Along these lines, we should think of the ability of architects to construct new worlds and to encourage new forms of inhabitation or habits in these worlds. In its physical autonomy, a building could be conceived as a world, that it would start from an internal logic and that it would unwind outwards to meet the edges of other worlds and transform them. That was the project of Nelson Goodman. That this transformation could also transgress the conventional boundaries between building and context, so that a new spatial relationship could emerge, a new geography to describe the terrain in which architects operate. Yet, in taking on this scope, architecture should maintain a certain level of operative autonomy and behave more like an object rather than a system, than systemic thinkers who are blindly translating from ecology and technology would like us to see. These ideas are not foreign to our palette of moves, nor to the history of our formal preoccupations. Every other building alternates between constructing an internal world and inscribing part of the horizon that links it to the world. The quasi-object character, to borrow from Michel Serres, of much of contemporary architecture is latently pointing to this direction and impatiently waiting to be exposed, to be explored, and to be expressed. Thank you.
Lacking as I do Andre's six-pack abs, I also shelter behind the podium. And I want Subcomandante Alex to know that I take the 5-minute incitement very seriously and will be terse. Here's the deal. The planet is urbanizing at the rate of 1 million people a week. That's a city of 150,000 every day. Megacities and sprawl don't cut it, nor 50% in slums. We need fine new cities. These must have the most historic character in action of cities. They must conduce propinquity. Cities must always also be physical. This, of course, keeps us in business. It's also necessary for democracy and the empathy that works it out. Cities too large, too uniform, too phony, or too immaterial do not raise the bonds and affinities of place. Cities make citizens, and urban design, or whatever you guys want to call it, is political. Cities define our outlook for action. Let's make humane, equitable, sustainable, and beautiful cities. Enough said? Any disagreements? We really can't screw around. The situation is authentically new. The magnitude unprecedented. Precipitous decline in the planetary environment may annihilate us. Enormous global population flows cut both ways, towards impermanence and diversity. Means of individual mobility, primary generator of urban form and then some, have been completely radicalized. We are only a century beyond animal power, and the current omega mode, the internal combustion car, is near the end of the line. We need a lot of new cities and a lot of better old ones, and they should assume many morphologies. We are very far from done with inventing the form of the city. Neither the reflexive reproduction of historic types, nor the inscriptions of weird architectures, nor the go-with-the-flow of urban capital sluts, nor the blurring of disciplinary boundaries with nothing to lose, and how does architecture manage to escape this all-for-one stuff, will work it out alone. Let's have real research, real theory, real skepticism, real enthusiasm, real compassion, real art, and real politics. Any problems so far? May I have a slide, please? Some work. First, some theoretical cities that investigate an envisioned urbanism that includes priority to people on foot, primacy of neighborhoods, limits to growth, elimination of zoning by use, and a general remix of blue, green, and built spaces. Second, images of a new town in China which challenge these desires with exigencies of sight and culture and other noisome realities. I am convinced that cities should head for autarky. Call it import substitution or zeroing out basic respiratory loops, but I think cities need to supply their own food, energy, water, thermal behavior, air quality, movement systems, building and cultural, communal, and economic institutions. Finally, this urban self-sufficiency as a means to political autonomy and planetary responsibility is something my nonprofit organization called Terraform has been pursuing in a plan to make the ecological footprint, with apologies to Gordon Cullen, the ecological footprint of New York City literally coterminous with its political one. The city become entirely autonomous. These are images of the kinds of formal transformations and remix that might result from this kind of thought experiment. It's something. Sustainable, equitable, and beautiful. Anybody got a problem with that? Thank you.
Go get him.
Hi, could I have the first slide, please? Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Well, first I'd like to thank the Dean and Professors Alex Krieger and Raul Merotra, for the invitation to participate in these proceedings. It's really an honor to be here. I'm Georgine Theodore. I'm a professor at NJIT, where I direct the infrastructure planning program. And I and my two partners, Tobias Amborst and Daniel Dioka, lead the office Interborough in Brooklyn. And we formed our office in 2002 after graduating from the GSD. And I think it's of interest to the discussions today and yesterday that we all studied in the UPT department in the days when planners and architects took studio together. And during that time, we took studios and courses with many of the people who have participated in the presentations over the past day and a half. People who influence us, such as Gerald Caden, Alex Krieger, Rodolfo Machado, Hashem Sarkis, Roger Sherman, Richard Sommer, Frank Vigier, and I listed them all in alphabetical order, like our panel. And also Margaret Crawford, who's not here today, but also had a significant influence. So the position I want to take here today on the panel is that of a practitioner. We're in urban design practice, and by briefly showing you some of the things that we do, I'd like to sort of lay out what urban design in practice means to us. We have a pretty wide range of project types and clients. Can I have the next slide? Oh, wait, how do I just go like this, right? Yep. We do neighborhood plans, like the one we recently completed for the city of Newark. And the project, of course, includes a plan and zoning recommendations, but it also introduces new tools like an interactive model and a set of postcards of scenes from the neighborhood for residents to caption that helped us to see the city from different perspectives. We do many research projects, and these projects most often deal with emerging urban issues, such as shrinking cities, dead malls, how to make public transit work in the suburbs, and so on. An example of one of our research projects is the project Improve Your Lot. This project was sponsored by the German Federal Cultural Foundation, and it's about the vacant land crisis in Detroit. And our project visualizes the process by which existing residents have taken advantage of shrinkage to improve their lot by expanding into and improving vacant land next to their homes. And we also sort of advocate for ways to strengthen this process. Or another ongoing research project, I put this one in for Andres, is our study of naturally occurring retirement communities, or what we call NORCs, in New York City. NORCs are communities like building complexes or neighborhoods with a very high percentage of seniors that weren't actually planned or designed to house the elderly. And this project was sponsored by the New York State Council on the Arts. And it examines how the much maligned modernist typology, the tower in the park, has actually found a new calling. Or the project Made in Midtown, a project we did as Urban Design Fellows at the Design Trust for Public Space. Here we worked with an interdisciplinary team to visualize the ecologies of New York City's garment district. You can see my two partners, Tobias and Dan, there on the right. And as a follow-up to this work, we recently published an interactive feature on Places, the magazine. And in What's Going On in the Garment District, that's the title, we present our research through a constructed section of the district, and it's a visualized index that links the viewer to the district's actors and processes, as well as to anecdotal stories that reside behind the district's walls. We sometimes do educational campaigns. We were hired by the International Longshoremen's Association to help advocate for keeping a container port in Bayonne, New Jersey. And we do a lot of exhibitions. For example, this piece that was commissioned by the Walker Arts Center to tell the story of how a dead mall can reinvent itself. And we do public space design, like the temporary sculpture park we developed for the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And the program here called for the design of a contemporary arts venue, but we conceived of it as a space of encounter for multiple publics. Now, while we often theorize our work, writing and lecturing about what we do, we've never tried to situate our approach with any of the urbanisms that have been discussed so passionately this weekend. New urbanism, landscape urbanism, ecological urbanism, but also everyday urbanism, post-urbanism, and so on. I guess I should also put in landscape infrastructuralism. Why? Because we haven't yet felt the need to. Our experience so far has been that the world out there is much more interesting, more outrageous, sometimes more inequitable, but sometimes also more fun than we ever could imagine. And we try to understand as much as we can of any given situation before letting our design thinking get in the way. And then we allow ourselves the freedom to choose from any tool in the arsenal of urban design, be it new, post, or everyday. So while we don't position ourselves on the spectrum, the one important position we take is that we understand urban design as an inherently critical and progressive practice. So while you might be able to design an apartment or a shoe store without much of a critical position, once you add the word urban to design, you enter into the realm of politics. Every design decision in the urban realm is inherently political. There are winners and losers, and while you might not choose to be a member of a particular party or school, in the end you have to pick a side. So design is increasingly enmeshed in an expanding network of actors like real estate speculators, politicians, activists, but also unsuspecting individuals who make use of architecture every day and therefore constantly transform it. So urban design for us means being curious about all of this and finding ways to understand the different individuals and forces that act upon the design of the urban. And we do this on one hand in order to understand our own ability to act within this network, but on the other hand, to enrich the design project itself, using the city's complexity as raw material for production. So what I'd like to do now is show you one way in which we tried to understand some of the tools that people have invented and are still inventing to make and remake the city. Some of them are evil, and some of them are good. And And looking at this project, you'll see how blurry the lines have become between understanding, researching, and designing. And in this way, I'd like to respond to Richard's earlier question about empiricism versus projection. We were commissioned by Kees Christianse to curate the American wing of the 2009 Rotterdam Architecture Biennial, and the overall theme was open city design and coexistence. And one of the pieces we developed was the arsenal of exclusion and inclusion, in which we compiled 101 weapons that designers, planners, policymakers, developers, and other urban actors use to restrict or promote access to urban space. I should say that we wrote some of the entries, but most of them were written by experts in their respective fields. And so the arsenal of exclusion includes sort of minor, seemingly benign things like no loitering signs and classical music. That's stuff that's blasted in some shopping center parking lots to keep skateboarders away. But also big headline-grabbing things like mortgage discrimination, racial deed restrictions and restrictive covenants, things that were used historically and are now illegal, but still have an impact on the way that the city works today. The arsenal also includes policies like blood relative ordinance, but also physical things like bombs, fences, and those armrests that they put on park benches to make sure homeless people don't get too comfortable. And this project also includes a very different story about the smaller and less battle-tested arsenal of inclusion, a collection of policies, institutions, and practices that have been used to facilitate access to our cities and suburbs, and thereby have afforded millions of people opportunities for betterment. Excuse me. On the one hand, the arsenal of inclusion includes weapons designed to fight fire with fire by planners, policymakers, and community activists bent on opening the city with ambitious and modest game-changing policy tools like busing, inclusionary zoning, community land trusts, displacement-free zones. These strong tactics of the weak look to undermine market idealizations and reverse some of the long-standing damage done by the arsenal of exclusion. And while the respective successes of these weapons are sometimes difficult to evaluate, for example, it could be argued that in some American cities, busing and public housing did more to segregate than integrate. These weapons are, in some respects, the best hope for achieving more equity in our metropolitan regions. On the other hand, the arsenal inclusion also includes GPS navigation, flat fares, Halloween, jury duty, and designated smoking zones. These are everyday phenomena that are facilitating access unintentionally. And they're not conceived by architects, planners, or policymakers, but these weapons are nonetheless weapons that we think architects, policies, and policymakers would be wise to co-opt. Though they open the city accidentally, they're potentially very effective weapons in the fight for more open cities. And we also commissioned architects and designers to imagine and develop new tools that could increase access, such as Frank Ruchala and Michael Piper's Pool House that deals with opening up and increasing access to an urban typology, the private master plan community. Roger Sherman's Big Box, which everyone saw earlier today, that deals with opening up the big box store to other uses and other users. Educational tools like the Center for Urban Pedagogy's Affordable Housing Toolkit, and James Rojas' design-based urban planning model, which deals with understanding the underlying, it doesn't deal with understanding the underlying code of the city, but more with starting a conversation about the planning and the making of the city. So you see that this project blurs the boundary between understanding the ways in which the city has been made and designing tools to remake the city. And by focusing on the tools and techniques that have been used to make the city and tools that could be used to remake the city, we want to emphasize this understanding of the city as something that has been constructed. It doesn't develop according to some natural law of urbanization or according to some invisible hand, but it's based on big and small decisions, many of them bad, that were implemented by using specific tools. But this denaturalization of the city implies an ultimately optimistic and progressive position. We as architects, planners, urban designers, or just people can actually reconstruct and change the city in ways big and small with the right tools. The city is makeable. Thank you.
Hi, can I have the first slide on, please? Please. Anyone in the other side? Sorry? It's a PowerPoint with my name. It's in the appropriate folder, I suppose. Vallejo, Vallejo. Well, I will start. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here in this 50th anniversary of the department. My name is José Luis Vallejo. I'm here because this term I'm part of the faculty at GSD, Urban Planning and Design Department. I'm teaching at one of the option studios. I'm going to talk briefly about my own experience dealing with the outside reality. Yes, thank you. I'm supposed to be an architect, but many architects think that what we do is not within the boundaries of architecture. Well, who cares? I wouldn't like to be dogmatic at all, so you will judge by yourselves if our experience can be considered a position. I'm part of a team of professionals named Ecosistema Urbano, Urban Ecosystem, and our name is our program. The focus of our work is on the complex phenomenon of the city, combining the work of architects, engineers, planners, and sociologists. We like to work in the worst possible urban environments, and the 20th century has provided us with an enormous extension of them. Our main challenge is always to take care for the public, since we believe the concept of the city is completely linked to the creation of public space. Here are some examples. A temporary and light urbanism developed in an area formerly occupied by a landfill, presently in a phase of ecological rehabilitation. After this phase is completed, there should be a new decision-making process. A reconfiguration of the public spaces of a newly born suburb that has grown due to the real estate speculation more than from the real need of housing. 3 pavilions or artificial trees function like open structures to multiply resident-selected activities. The air tree is a light structure, easily dismantleable and energetically self-sufficient. A kindergarten surrounded by transportation infrastructures and an industrial site in which the public space we incorporate creates the conditions where social interaction can take place while incorporating the idea of education on sustainability. The whole waters of the building are purified by natural means in front of the eyes of the children while they are playing around. Public space is thereby a central issue of our work. Ecosistema Urbano tries to catalyze urban processes that help citizens to change their own environment through proactive interventions. This is an experimental prototype of intervention in a contemporary urban public space capable of creating the conditions to empower the use of the collective space, a self-sufficient climatic comfort generator that is being used not only as a breathing space, but as well interactively real-time connected with the climatic conditions. This is a participative urban furniture that can be configured depending on the needs, talking, relaxing, eating, sleeping, playing, considering the city as a playground more than a battlefield. We also try to cross as much as we can, the supposed boundaries of the profession of architecture, landscape, and urban planning, since we believe there shouldn't be at this moment an unidirectional and preconceived point of view related to the urban phenomena. We even organized demonstrations. Or we ran a platform that develops social networks and manage online channels around the subject of creative urban sustainability, building networks to share knowledge and experiences. At this moment, for us, internet is the space where the most successful models of collective creation and self-organization are taking place. A much more interesting field than the, endogamic world of architecture. Internet is the most democratic space, the platform where every citizen can express freely and horizontally, the space where ideas flow in every direction. Regarding the education of our discipline, we consider the model of professional as it is still being educated is no longer responding to society needs. At GSD, we are running a studio called Urban Social Design that focuses in the exciting city out there beyond these walls. We believe that over decades, cities have been conceived, designed, and built from a physical point of view, considering mainly their infrastructures, buildings, technologies, materials, geometry, rather than processes, relationships, patterns, and significant networks. By urban social design, we understand the design of environments spaces and dynamics in order to improve social relationships, generating the conditions for interaction and self-organization. Our studio participants come from diverse programs within the school and bring to the table a wide range of previous experiences and backgrounds. The students participating in the studio draft a mission statement as their first collaborative activity. This is part of their statement, using their own words. We aim to create, amplify, reorganize, and improve public spaces in Boston: architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, and urban planning. Each of these professions has grappled with public space design for a long time, resulting at this moment in a limited and conventional approaches. Through collaboration, we will create a new approach to public space design, opening the definition of design itself to include a true interdisciplinary approach. We will learn from each other's different backgrounds and perspectives to ask better questions and understand layers of information previously ignored. I hope we can achieve this by the end of this term. Many thanks.
I would like to invite the speakers to please join me at the table. Alex Krieger has, does this work? You can hear me? Yeah. Alex has lent us 15 minutes, so in other words, our discussion will go until 3:45. Without much ado, I just wanted to, by way of sharpening the differences between the different positions and heightening their originality, ask two questions, put two questions on the table with the idea that each of the speakers should feel free to respond to both or just to one, and then I will open the discussion to the public. My two questions have to do with the recourse to history as a way of positioning ourselves today. And it seems to me that some of us did situate our position in relation to some historical lineage or tried to draw a thread into the historical material that we have in front of us as a way of justifying or validating what we're doing. And in other cases, people refuse to look at history, started from the present forward. And whether you could respond to that, especially if you haven't looked at history, and why you haven't. And then the second position has to do more with the kind of role that positioning usually allocates to another adversarial position, meaning if you were to articulate where do you stand vis-a-vis another position that seems to be the opposite of what you're doing, or one that you're dissatisfied with today, which one would it be, and how would you articulate the differences between you and that position? Just as a way of warming up, I, for one, feel that the global city discourse has become exhausting and has exhausted the possibilities of instrumentalizing urban design in response to certain problems. And I also find the city as a spatial model to be limiting, and that's why I seek recourse in the past to find possibilities of thinking of other entities or reformulating the entity of the city. Maybe we can start with you, José Luis.
Well, which was exactly the question. Sorry.
Maybe we can start with you, Pierre. No, the question is simply this. If you were to position yourself in terms of a historical lineage, what would it be? And if you were to position yourself against another position today, what would it be?
Well, my position would be, I mean, I'm in the position, panel. So my position would be facing the future. I don't really know how it's going to be the future. As well, Andres said that we had to make a statement for the future, and that we might have to make answers for the future. So our answer for the future is that we don't really know what we are doing, but what we really know is that we have out there a city that is claiming, and a society that is claiming for a change inside the field of architecture, planning, and landscape. So we are trying to face that more or less, that we are trying to be more close to the society. That's one of our main statements.
I'll respond to the first question, the question about history. And as I had sort of mentioned in my talk, I mean, I think that in our sort of practice of urban design, we really see it as a continuum, sort of really looking closely at what's there, responding to that, but then mining it for potential for a sort of for projective intervention. And so I don't think that that means that what we do has to look like what we've seen before, but because of the complexity of the urban condition, we have to sort of recognize what's there in order to make it operative.
Well, we're all obviously immersed in history, and many of us are academics. So one of the questions that one presents to students is, where do good ideas come from? What's the kind of primal question that one asks in relationship to cities and to architecture? And I am interested in history essentially as a kind of cathexis of desire. If you speak to a student about a desirable condition, logically it springs from their own experience. So if your peak urban experience was the day you were walking along the Grand Canal in Venice and Esther's bonnet flew off and Guido, the gondolier, speared it with his oar, somehow this is all wrapped up with the physical character of the space. But then we confront the translation problem. This is where history becomes a kind of thorny endeavor. In order to recreate that kind of site of intense desire, I think one does not make the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. The question of the series of intermediate possibilities, however, is something that we, are obliged to grapple with now and forever. In terms of a kind of something in which I would place myself in opposition, I alluded to this in the tiny talk, which is, I think there is abroad a kind of inevitablism, that we are powerless in the face of the tsunami of capital flows, and our job is to somehow ornament the inescapable. I'm not on with that. I think that we live in a country where, for example, we are getting a more and more grotesque income gap, which in turn reproduces itself in new patterns of resegregation in cities. I'm opposed to this. I think a lot of architects are not.
In terms of history, one of the things that my brother went to Harvard 15 years ago. And
so hung up on the Ivy League, Andres.
No, I love Harvard. And one of the things that he said that was really quite interesting, he said, what you're doing is outside the discourse. I said, that's interesting. What's the discourse? I found out, the discourse. And ever since then, I've realized that one of the things Harvard does is have things inside and outside the discourse. If a student brings up new urbanism, you might say, well, that may very well be interesting, but we're not talking about that. Now, you can put, I think, intellectual things inside or outside the discourse, but it's very hard to put physical ones outside. When you're sitting in the middle of Cambridge, living in Cambridge and Boston, it's very hard to say, oh, by the way, everything out there is outside the discourse, because there's a persistence to physical reality. And I look at when they say, well, that was then, it isn't now, that was then. But no, people right now are living there. Right now, you and I, parents, children, going to school, learning a living, how can something that persists and is still inhabited and actually has manifestations of success and failure be outside the discourse? It's just absolutely like medieval theology. If you say, well, we're really discussing the number of angels and the head of the pin, well, fine. But it's very hard in urbanism to do that. And I would say it's almost incredible. And I think Sert had a lot to do with it because he was the first guy that asked all the questions. Every day when he came to school, all the answers were present and he didn't see it. And it was that genetic flaw that has been bred into this program and many other programs. The other thing in terms of the opposing, two things that I oppose that are interesting. One is, I'm a bottom-up planner. I do think that the 21st century has the Gideon's problem of large numbers, efficient decision-making, and so forth, may require a thorough readjustment of top-down planning. And I think as in the 30s, and nobody knows this because it's not proper to say, one of the things about fascism is its incredible efficiency. Yes, of course, they lose wars and they kill people, but nobody said it wasn't efficient. Okay? And so fascism is outside the discourse. But actually, what the Chinese are running is fascism. It's a top-down, corporatist, extremely efficient. And they can do things like lay out power grids at 100 times the efficiency of democracy. And I think that at some point in the lifetime of the youngest people here, democracy again will come in for a crisis the way it did in the 30s, in which lots of intelligent people were saying, you know what, we need Robert Moses back. And look at the Chinese, we just can't afford the luxury of American democracy. And that's, very obnoxious to me, but I think an argument can be made that in the 21st century, the problem of large numbers requires a lot more top-down planning.
In regards to the first question, I actually look at history for reasons, not stylistic reasons, not reasons of how can we, yes, indeed, people still live in old cities, but old cities perhaps are the result of particular processes. And I'm very interested in what gave rise to those processes and what responses were made as a result. And we are at a time when looking at those processes are important to find simple answers not as to typological answers, but answers as to how did actually things get done and why. And so design responses that came with particular forms of legislation, particular forms of public engagement, and so forth that led in turn to the creation of new kinds of urbanism or new kinds of places. That information to me is very important as a form of understanding history. So not necessarily
the objects themselves, but the processes and the thought processes that led to the creation of the objects or the spaces.
Thanks. I think this works. I'll simply mention a few things. There was a comment yesterday from a gentleman saying that we need a new type of urban professional within the design disciplines. I think we already have it. We're just not paying attention. Can I see a show of hands in terms of who has a degree in civil engineering here? 2, 3. Okay, I think we need to pay attention. There's approximately 500,000 civil engineers out there that are doing urban design. They just don't call it that. What I'm particularly interested in terms of history is the fact that the preeminent discipline of the 19th and 20th century has been operating without history or without theory. Top 10, a book on the top 10 major public works of the 20th century doesn't count as theory. And I would argue that we're not paying attention to a field who literally is the urban service professional that we're speaking about. My personal interest as a landscape architect who has been trying to understand with a very young history of the field of landscape architecture, which is being played as being a surrogate to a preeminent discipline of the 19th century urbanism, which is architecture. And at the turn of the 20th century, there was a number of colleagues or groups of people who asked to put the prefix of landscape in front of architecture as a project of reform and renewal of the City Beautiful movement. That dealt with Benjamin Clark Marsh, who was somewhat disgruntled at the first city planning conference in 1909, when Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. essentially proposed this. And I would argue that 100 years later, exactly, we should be asking the same question in terms of a shift that's occurring. Because I think it's happening at such a large scale and such an order of magnitude that we can't see it. And so I would argue with the proposal that I put forth this evening, not as a polemic, but merely as a project, not as a discipline and not as a field, but in fact a project that a number of people can participate in by placing the prefix of landscape in front of the preeminent discipline of the 20th century, which is infrastructure itself. I believe that in the future, and immediately as we speak, those cities of 100,000 a day are building themselves. They don't need urban designers. They need infrastructure. We need to put water, fresh water, and deliver it to those people. That's what equity is. We need to deliver energy to those people because between 60 and 70% of the world does not have access to electricity. And so when we think that the work of infrastructure is merely technocratic, I would actually argue that there is a geopolitical agency to the project of infrastructure that I would argue for those who are thinking that they need other work to participate in, I would actually say that there is a huge field and all we have to do is actually walk down the road to MIT and understand that they are doing the work right now. And if we are to get serious in urbanism, we need to engage this field, not a counterattack, but understand that the one fundamental aspect that civil engineer does not have at his disposal for its agency of the future is ecology. And that's why you're seeing a lot of large corporations at the moment acquiring some of the largest landscape architecture firms across the world right now. Why? Because they're missing out on the understanding of how to design and how to construct ecology. And the people who know how to do that are landscape architects. They don't know how to theorize about it properly. They don't know how to discourse about it properly. But I'll argue that if we place ourselves within this larger project, within this historical continuum, which I actually believe in, which is actually really important, that project needs to start now because it hasn't really been catalyzed. And I believe that this is one of the primary reasons for actually joining the Graduate School of Design is because despite the fact that I'd written specifically, and most of them knew this, that I thought that the design professions need to deprofessionalize. They are caught in silos and they're not addressing the preeminent challenges of our day and the projects. Most of them knew this. A number of other faculty supported this, knowing that there is a project ahead of us. I believe that it is the project of landscape infrastructure and that we can all engage in it, and it's not intended to draw boundaries between anyone as opposed to actually rally everyone to be able to understand how to bring equity towards the infrastructure of cities in the future.
I will turn the microphones to the audience. So,
Could I just make a comment about that, about engineering, which I very much approve of? They are designing the public realm of America, you know, without actually going all the way to vast power grids. They're designing the streets and the roads and the way we drain things. And it's very, very important that actually there be, that at that level, there be a connection, if not at the largest level. And let me tell you one thing, it's not that hard. They only look at about 3 pages in that fat book. The fat book is just for prestige. There's only 3 pages. I know how to do traffic engineering. I know how to do the drainage stuff. It's not that hard. And actually, they also know how to plant trees. And one of the things the new urbanists have done, because we're a movement, by the way, and not individuals, is that we can have people at LEAD ND, you know, attending 100 meetings. We can have people at the ITE to actually completely affect the new manual that just came out, called context-based design. We can have people at I just saw the new standards for Habitat for Humanity, and I just want to bring up one other subject. There was a position made here about individuals.
if you don't mind, we have very limited time. Sorry.
Individuals. I'm sorry. I'm speaking. Individuals.
The audience wants to speak.
Okay. Can I just say one thing? I'm not subject to Greenwich time. I'm not an Anglo.
Neither am I.
Okay. So stop acting like one. I'm trying to say something. He spoke a real long time, and I'm going to try to say something. Okay? It's very important that we understand that the people who've changed the world are movements. It was CM who changed the world. It was Team 10. It was the new urbanists, and it's going to be the landscape urbanists. And those who continue to operate individually, as a position that was made today, are not going to get very far, and it's a very, very sort of 20th century, out-of-date way to think.
Okay.
Can I add one thing?
No. Please.
It'll take 30 seconds.
No. Pierre, please.
Okay.
I turn the microphone and questions to the audience.
All I was simply going to say,
Look, can I say one
I
thing?
was just going to say that actually,
You're
it's
voted
not-
down.
We actually don't, we have solved the problem of designing infrastructure. It's actually the question of financing for the future of it.
Questions, sir.
Uwe Brandis, how's MARC in 95? Actually, perfect segue. The one thing we have not talked about enough, Andres barely touched it, is the financial architecture of our cities. And it is unbelievable, I think, the degree to which we have this conversation isolated from that. We live in a world where now, and this is a very recent phenomenon really, many important companies see their business future in the development of the city. And the manner in which the city is monetized in order to pay for the absolute necessary infrastructure that, I think we made that point very well, is the urban design and it is the urban equity conversation. So I just wanted to put that out there. I don't think we can solve that problem right now, but I think on a moving forward basis for this school, we're in this wonderful position of having other schools in very close proximity that are actually thinking about this actively now. And it has to be part of the conversation.
Other questions? Would you like to respond? Anita would like to respond.
I don't have a response to this comment. I actually had a question for Pierre, or a response to that, which is that I feel that the use of infrastructure or landscape infrastructure is extraordinarily vague, or perhaps when one relates it to engineering, not necessarily the way one would want to go exactly, because I think what we need to bring to the table is what is it that we do that can add to what engineers have done. Because the kinds of infrastructural works that you're talking about are hideous, in a way, and from the humanistic point of view. Furthermore, the first designers of highways in the country, people like Clark and Rapuano, were landscape architects, and really hybridized an engineering project with an experiential one. And that part was lost, and the engineers took over and won the race. And isn't it also a conversation about how do we recover that we had invented or added to civil engineer. By the way, civil engineers also design wetlands, design everything, absolutely everything that we also do in studios here. But yet they don't have either the cultural agenda, the philosophical underpinnings, the kind of vision that we could possibly bring, which I hope it's more than what they do. But that needs to be articulated, and it needs to be brought forward. We don't want infrastructure as in China, uncritical, unqualified, inhuman, unecological. We need to, in fact, recover a kind of critical position about infrastructure that will tie it to a human condition. I mean, I think, really.
Michael wants to add something.
Two vaguely related points. One, I would like to criticize the idea that the notion of efficiency can be decoupled from the social. Because if it is, one produces the conundrum of asking the Chinese peasant, would you rather have an air conditioner or a vote? This is not an answerable question. I would also like to suggest that the notion of the top-down be divorced from the idea of the large scale. We have plenty of top-down planning. The question is, who's at the top? We desperately need large-scale planning, but the question is, under whose direction? And I'm going to continue to insist for the remainder of the day that democratic practices trump fascist ones pretty much every day of the week.
Next question from the audience. Any other questions?
Are you saying that this is what I'm for? Remember, I was positioning the opposite. I was asked to make the opposite case. Got it?
Over there. Question from the audience.
This is the problem with you. It's never entirely clear.
Hi, Ricardo de Piero 90, MAUD. I have a question, or a comment about efficiency. In terms of let's say the struggle, or what Rodolfo Machado referred to yesterday about the kittens fighting. When we talk about efficiency, and usually we lose the argument in terms of engineering. It's happened, I think, many times that the engineer wins because he is more efficient. He uses the argument of sort of efficiency against the excesses of design, and somehow we've been losing space or a battle with this the concept of efficiency because we always somehow are looking for a little more, something more than the minimal. I'm thinking about also Georges Bataille talking about the fact that nature was never efficient. Nature was all about the excess of life and death, and life and death, and life and death. And maybe a lot of what we talk about when we deal with beauty, the idea of beauty seems to come up to or against efficiency. And efficiency has become sort of a myth that has taken a great deal of has invaded our shores somehow. We've been invaded and are losing territory. And we have to, I think, I'm not sure what we're going to do about it, but efficiency is a very dangerous word for us also.
I am being signaled that we're out of time, right? Okay,
Can we respond to that?
Please respond to efficiency.
Is there a response? I would argue that very directly that our segue as designers into that discussion is to be able to first understand that design is not style. Design is about synthesis, number one. Number two, when we talk about efficiency, the number one way in which designers can actually play exactly the same game and actually level the playing field with engineers is understand externalities. Civil engineers in general, are masters at externalizing a number of issues out of their control. Whatever's not in their control, biodynamic processes, for example, or other long-term effects are not internalized as part of the work. So therefore, if there is, for example, an imperative for a new regional project also currently with civil engineering projects, our work as designers is to expose the effects, either long-term or short-term, at other scales at which engineers do not address in order to first critique, become conversant with another notion of performance of design.
The Dean has given us 5 more minutes, so Michael.
Another notion. I would like to speak about the relationship between individualism and efficiency. Susan spoke a bit yesterday, and this is kind of one of the mantras of conferences like this, about the homogenizing tendencies of globalization, et cetera, et cetera. Big problem. But I would suggest that perhaps that individual artistic achievement is perhaps the most efficient way of producing difference in a global culture that militates very strongly for sameness.
May I just something about the efficiency?
Sure.
Okay, one thing about efficiency. Efficiency in the world of engineering is actually value added. It costs more, do I get the value back? And I think there are a lot of things that actually designers expect to be, of value are actually not. They simply cost more, nobody appreciates them, nobody even likes them. What's extraordinary about landscape urbanism is that biophilia, I think, is the breakthrough. I think when you actually green things physically, people really value that. That's what I find continually transcendental about the landscape position, is you can actually take modern architecture and for the first time, get the middle class to like it, by actually making it physically green. And I think that actually is the first time that actually quite, design of the kind that is considered avant-garde and so forth can actually connect with the American middle class. I think that's an enormously important, position to take, the biophilia position. It is always considered added value.
Question?
I'd rather talk about the 60s, but maybe I ought to talk about what you've most recently been talking about, which is infrastructure. The one word I'd say about Andreas's comments about the 60s, I was a bit bemused. I wasn't sure. It was great theater, and I don't know if that was the intent. There wasn't a whole lot of information that I recognized as being real. But to turn to infrastructure for a moment, architects and urban designers and landscape architects and planners have been asked to lead major national, at least in the US, the design of large infrastructure projects, at least for the length of my career. And they have really transformed the way it's designed, although I must say that it's not in the majority. It's difficult to sometimes encourage a municipality, a state, the federal government to have such a project led by architects and urban designers, but it's not out of the question. There are many examples. I think that there is and I'm not disagreeing with the point about working with civil designers and so on, but I think that we are asked to lead, and we're expected to lead. I do think that I would disagree with Andreas. If you've skimmed through 3 books, it doesn't make you capable of...
Who says? And besides, I was there in the 60s, by the way. I graduated in 71.
It takes more. It takes a little bit more. But there are billions of dollars out there for infrastructure. It's tough to get at them. I think the invitation is sometimes weak, but the opportunity is considerable for us to make substantial contributions.
I think... And then it led to another policy, also well-intentioned, but we all know what happened with that, and that is urban renewal. But we're at a very important turning point, partly because our infrastructure is aging and also because our population is aging. I think we are at the cusp of a political transformation where we can have another policy, and this one will be reimagining our infrastructure. But this is more than just a physical infrastructure. It's a completely revolutionary way of looking at infrastructure as a social infrastructure as well, because as you said, we are an aging population. And I think this is a very important time, and we should be talking to the Obama administration.
On the notion of policy as being the shaper of cities, can anyone respond?
Well, one thing, I think it's important to separate the inaugural condition from the evolved condition. Mm-hmm. For example, there are all sorts of dictators that made Paris and Rome the way it was, and yet they become highly democratic, at some point. And there are also some very, very democratically conceived cities that ended up being very repressive in all sorts of social ways. And sometimes you need to make use, if you separate the inaugural condition, the motive force that actually creates cities, from its effect later, then that I think is a very useful distinction.
Say anything regarding
I can just ask one aspect here. I do believe, in addition to the two acts that you mentioned, that land use zoning is probably one of the most important structural mechanisms in the shape of the North American landscape. Infrastructure itself, the layout of highways, was essentially a consolation prize from the establishment of 4 categories of land uses in the 1920s. I'm not talking about height restrictions here, but what happened in Euclid in Ohio. And I think if we are to rethink the multiple dimensions of infrastructure in the future, spatial, social, aesthetic, discursive, long-term and short-term ones, I think we need to address fundamentally the one denominator that's not on the table right now, which is zoning. And I think right now there's been a fundamental misunderstanding in the field of planning right now, that as if zoning is planning. And it's not the same. Planning is about envisioning the future. Zoning is not. Zoning is about controlling the future. It's about segregation. And so therefore, if we are to enter the ecological project into the dezoning or rezoning project, we need to bring that into the equation in order to start dismantling and reassembling.
Michael, you get the last word.
Oh, goody. You left out a couple of things, including FHA loans at very low rates for white veterans if they would go live in the suburbs, accelerated depreciation, huh? Yeah. But the zoning thing is very important. I do think that we are entering an age where we can evolve beyond the idea of zoning by use in post-industrial cities. This will make very interesting conditions. But I would also say that, you know, the whole atmosphere surrounding zoning and planning is caught up in the scientific discourse of modernity. And if we can create zoning laws that are much more transparent to the actuality of desires, if we can say that each apartment will have a beautiful view of a tree or the moon, instead of some insane formula based on a kind of fonus balonus mathematical algorithm, then I think that our laws will be transparent with our wishes and our wills. So I would argue for a much more fulsomely expressed set of desires expressed via architectural and planning practices.
I say, and Michael wrote a brilliant book called Local Code that does precisely that. It's one of the best books that I've ever read.
Oh.
And it was very, very positively reviewed by Elizabeth Platter-Zeeberg when it came out.
On that amicable hug of positions, I would have really liked to give more room to the audience, but time is not on our side. So maybe the concluding remarks will bring you in as well, or the reception. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley.